Hi, everyone. Good evening and welcome. I just want to let you know that this presentation will be recorded tonight. So welcome and thank you so much for attending the School of Education Doctoral Student Colloquium series. Dr. MJ DiCarlo will be our faculty moderator this evening, and I would like to turn it over to Dr. DiCarlo. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy.
So welcome everyone to the School of Education Dr. Penny L. Hemrick Doctoral Student Colloquium series. We are so pleased to welcome all of our virtual attendees, including School of Education faculty, staff, students, the university body at large, our community members, and our partner associations, among others. The Colloquium series offers School of Education doctoral students and alumni an opportunity to share their original research and learn from their peers, faculty, and staff. Each month, one EDD and one PhD student present their research at the Colloquium. These sessions help doctoral students connect with each other and develop a peer community that is invaluable in supporting their journeys in their programs. Each doctoral student or alumni presenter is also asked to write a research brief that relates to their presentation. This is then included in an edited publication titled Doctoral Student Research Briefs, which is published on the School of Education website and actually as a small set of issues of bound copies. The research brief is a way to disseminate our doctoral students' research as shared in the colloquium and to do so in a concise format with relevance to education. This evening, each presenter will be provided with 20 minutes to share their research. We will then move on to questions and answers. Please save your questions for the end of the presentations, the end of each presentation, respectfully. If you have your questions, you are welcome when we get to the question and answer to either come off mute and use your mic to ask questions, or you can type your questions into the chat here in the Zoom. So our first presenter is Tamecah Pinkney, who is a PhD student in the School of Education. Tamecah is a Black second-year part-time PhD student in the Education Leadership and Policy program at Drexel University's School of Education. For the last 23 years, she has enjoyed challenging the minds of the 8th grade science students she teaches in Wilmington, Delaware. As a Black public school teacher, she has developed a passion for connecting with her diverse students and their families. As a wife, mother of 2 school-age children, full-time teacher, and part-time doctoral student, she is also hyper-aware of the complex challenges of being involved and engaged in her own children's education. However, she does not let this interfere with the part she wants to play as a parent and a Black educator. Consequently, her research focuses on how families and schools connect to improve student experiences and student achievement. In the coming years, Tamecah will continue championing better home and school relationships so that her middle school students can achieve and excel in their academics. Today, Tamecah is going to share her presentation entitled Reconnecting Broken Bonds, a case study of one middle school's model for reestablishing an effective home and school connection. Tamecah?
Thank you very much, Dr. DiCarlo. Good evening. It is an honor and a privilege to share this work with you. This presentation does represent my current scholarship as well as an area that I am personally passionate about. So without further ado, I would like to share with you Reconnecting Broken Bonds, a case study of one middle school's model for reestablishing effective home and school partnerships. As we go through this journey this evening, there are 6 areas of my study that I would like to share with you. First, giving you some background information that will help you understand my research. Then a review of the literature and the more salient aspects of this area of study, as well as gaps that I feel I have identified as they relate to the questions that I have. And then my theoretical framework, which is the lens through which I am approaching all of this information, as well as how I will be analyzing the data. My methods, which is how I'm approaching it, also how I'm going to collect, analyze, and make sense of the data I obtain. My potential findings, because this research is in its infancy, but I do have some hypotheses and some understandings of what I might find, and hopefully they will allow me to have some comparisons as I write up my final findings. And then finally, the significance of this work and how I feel it is important to the area of education. So who am I to do this work? As Dr. DeCarlo shared with you, I am a middle school science teacher. I teach the 8th grade. I have also been teaching for 23 years, all at the same school. I believe that this has helped me and puts me in a very unique position because it has helped me establish a reputation within the community in which I teach. I am also called upon uh, on numerous occasions to help solve problems, to be a thought partner, to brainstorm potential solutions for problems that we see happening in our school, or just to be proactive in helping students that attend our school. In 2007, I started the arduous process, or actually, no, I completed the rigorous process of becoming a nationally board certified teacher. And then right after that accomplishment, I jumped right into my master's studies. And in 2010, I earned my master's in instruction with a focus on teaching and learning. I believe these two things demonstrate the fact that I have an ongoing desire to better and hone my skills as a practitioner and shows my commitment to the educational field. I did stop my pursuit of education to become a wife and a mother. I do currently have two school-aged children, the oldest of which is actually a sixth grader at the school that I teach. And I believe becoming a mother has offered me a different perspective and has also solidified my commitment to being an educator. Viewing education through the lens of a mother and not just a teacher has given me a very unique perspective and also a unique connection with the families that I come in contact with. I am a second year part-time PhD student, which has challenges all on its own, but I did decide to pursue my PhD because I wanted to develop tools and learn research techniques to do the work that I am currently doing. And then finally, I do have a racial background, which means I'm more than just the educated Black female that you see sitting in front of you. My maternal grandmother was a Japanese American who spent 3 years of her teenage life in an internment camp during World War II. And why I share this with you is because that incident has made me hyper aware of social, racial, and cultural injustices that students and families go through. We have a very large immigrant population in my school, and those students tend to be very invisible and unseen and tend to fall through the cracks. And I want to be an ally for those students and those families in those particular situations. So, in an ideal world, 100% of parents and caretakers would be involved and engaged in the schooling of their children, especially at the secondary level, which tends to be grades 6 through 12. Homework would be done, phone calls and emails would be replied to, and students would take their education seriously. The reality of our situation in education is that parent involvement and engagement, as well as a lot of student achievement indicators, tend to decrease at the middle school level. And I want to acknowledge that a lot of times this reality comes from parents transitioning their children from an elementary setting where they have spent 6 years of their lives to a middle school setting where they will only spend 3. In addition to that, there is also a push for independence with children. And so parents tend to start backing off and allowing students to become more independent. That becomes a very slippery slope, which also affects student achievement. If we do nothing about this, we will continue to see a negative impact on student achievement, especially at the middle school level. And this has systemic repercussions because students who do not do well in middle school tend to be the first students who drop out in high school. If students are not graduating from high school, that means that they're not going to college, which means that they're not getting basic schooling requirements that will allow them to work at jobs that will actually help them be productive and earn a wage to have a family. So the purpose of my study is to develop a model to increase parent involvement and engagement that can also help improve student achievement at the middle school level. And there's two terms that keep coming up in this research, one of which is parental involvement. Joyce Epting in 1992 came up with a framework for parental involvement that involved these 6 spokes: parenting, communicating, volunteering, learning at home, decision-making, and collaborating with community. Somewhere along the timeline, we also started talking about student engagement. And I haven't really been able to pinpoint who or when or where that terminology came into play. But what I do know is that involvement versus parental engagement is a huge back and forth in this arena. And parental involvement does typically connotate a physical presence, with parents and caretakers being physically involved at events, doing things where they are visible, whereas parent engagement has a connotation of a non-physical presence, but still being involved in some way, shape, or form in the background, like the learning at home circle at the bottom. Now, when we put these two together and where this is going in the world of parental involvement versus parental engagement, is people want to start really talking about family and school partnerships. And the reason being, partnerships does not rely specifically on just the parent being involved, but it looks at a shared responsibility among all parties. And this is a terminology that I would like to use moving forward with this presentation. So not looking at just involvement or just engagement, but the partnerships between families and schools and everyone who is involved in a child's life. As the African proverbs say, it does take a whole village to raise a child. So I have 2 research questions that are going to guide my study. The first one is, in what ways do spatial and social factors influence family and school partnerships in middle school? And secondly, what are best practices and strategies for improving family-school partnerships in middle school within the context of critical geographies? As I looked at the literature, I wanted to first talk about the breakdown in the bonds between families and school. And as I thought about this, it led me back to desegregation. When you look at the research in desegregation, a lot of it is contrary to what I initially believed, that it was a good thing. When you dig deeper, you notice that it really broke down the bonds that Black families had with the schools that they were attending. In addition to that, there is also a breakdown with immigrants when they come in and not really having any community ties as well. Secondly, parents tend to be more involved at the elementary school level. There is a lot of research that does confirm that. And there's also that parent involvement and engagement decreases from elementary to high school. And then finally, parent involvement helps to improve student engagement outcomes. So when you take all of these 4 things and everything that comes with them, where my research comes into play is I'm looking to rebuild those home and school partnerships at the middle level, because I already recognize that a lot of these things change when students and families transition to middle school. Helping to rebuild those partnerships, I feel, will move students in a positive direction. And then also because I recognize that schools are not one thing or another, there's a huge community of people, a lot of different cultures. I want to also develop uh, a model where all cultures and communities that are represented in the school also feel connected to their school communities. So my theoretical framework, I'm using critical geographies, and I want to explore what school means, not only just the physical place of a school, but also the space that school takes up and occupies. Knowing how our country has gone through desegregation, and now recently with the influx of immigrants, and how um, people have been kind of left out of progressive movements, I really want to look at how geospatial realities affect the bonds people have with school. And then utilize critical geographies also to find these best practices and strategies for improving those connections. So again, our school not only represents the physical space, but also a place and the actual space. And a lot of parents have, from my personal experience, I deal with a lot of families who have horror stories about what they went through when they were high school. Well, I mean, when they were in middle school. And so when their children get into middle school, they're a little bit reluctant to deal with teachers. And so this is one of the areas that I feel really does need to be explored. How are parents unable, or what obstacles are keeping parents from engaging with their school communities? How I will be approaching my research, I intend to do an intrinsic case study and looking at a suburban middle school with a large minority population is going to be the case. A large minority population lends itself very well to looking at the aspects of how desegregation and how immigrants affect or having immigrant status affects the connection with the schools, and also looking at the low parental participation and low student achievement scores that also come from students moving to middle school. That will be the interesting phenomenon that I'm looking at. I want to do a mixed methods explanatory sequential design, where I will first collect quantitative data through a cross-sectional survey and use a Likert scale to support that quantitative data piece. And then for my qualitative data, have focus groups and one-on-one interviews to really get to the nuts and bolts of how parents are perceiving their connection with the schools that they attend. The data collection will happen in 3 different phases. The first will be the quantitative data collection and analysis. As I mentioned, I will do a cross-sectional parental involvement survey, and I will do it and look at it from 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, both separately and together as a whole school community. And I will use descriptive statistics to analyze that data. So looking at mean, median, mode. If I can do an intervention between phase 1 and phase 2, I will. At this particular point, I don't know what that intervention would be. I'm still working on developing that process. When I do move to the qualitative data phase, I will be doing grade level specific focus groups. So again, a 6th separate from a 7th, separate from an 8th, and then use the focus groups to identify parents who are willing to do one-on-one interviews. And then take the data collected from that to do a thematic analysis to see what the data is truly telling us. Where are our obstacles? Where are places that we are doing very well in? And then finally, my third phase will be the integration and model development part, where I'll be looking at the data and seeing what is it really telling us about the school partnerships? What is the data speaking to? It's important to do both the quantitative and the qualitative aspects, I believe, because numbers tell us one thing, but descriptive data and narratives tell us something completely different. And I think the value of doing mixed methods is having both of those qualitative and quantitative speaking to each other so that we can truly see and pick out the themes that are happening. That will also allow us to search for the best methods or the best practices for this. I'm sorry, I have too much up on my screen. All right. So my potential findings. I looked at this from several different aspects. What would students see? What would parents see? And what could the school teachers and admins see? I'm hopeful that should this research be successful, that students will perform better in their classes. We should also hopefully see more motivation from the student aspect and more student ownership. From a parental perspective, participation in school events will increase. And again, that can be both physical and non-physical, but the connection with the parents in the school should definitely see an increase. Also, partnerships will improve. And then hopefully parents will be more comfortable and more willing to take part in school decision making. And that we should see parents of different cultures and different backgrounds taking part in those decision making. From a school level perspective, we should see attendance at events improving, also two-way communication improving, and class grades improving. Taken all together, this is a community that is showing improvement, a community that shows that we are working together. And hopefully, I am very hopeful that moving forward, I can hopefully some of the data can support some of these things. And if not, I will definitely have a way to compare what I was thinking to what the data actually showed. And then finally, the significance of this study. I really feel like this research is something that is needed. I see a lot of parental involvement, parental engagement, parent partnerships at the elementary school level, but I haven't really come across significant research on the middle school level. So it is my hope that this study will contribute to a better understanding of the factors that are influencing and preventing family school partnerships in some middle schools. Also, the resulting model will be utilizing evidence-based strategies for middle schools, and those strategies will also help the school become more inclusive and foster supportive educational environments for students. When I really thought about long term, I'm hoping that this research can help us reconceptualize how we can better transition families into middle school, knowing that the transition from elementary to middle school can be very daunting for families. Middle schools need to be supportive of the communities that come into them. So reconceptualization is something that I feel needs to happen moving forward. And then finally, the information gathered from this study, I really hope can encourage further research in this area. Because again, if we're falling short at the middle school level, we have fewer kids who are graduating from high school. We have fewer kids who are going into colleges. We have fewer kids who are becoming college and career ready. And that's really what our education system should be about, is making our students able to survive on their own in society. Finally, I want to acknowledge my people, my village, Trifina, Monet, Tiffany, Karina, Tajma, Tareya, Jana, and Monique. I thank you for all your help in getting me ready and just being thought partners with me. And then before we leave, I have 2 questions for the audience. For generalizability, which I am hoping for in the very far in the future for this particular research. Do you think this research can apply to middle schools with different demographics? Again, I'm looking at a school with a high minority population. Would it be applicable and effective for middle schools that did not have those demographics? And do you have any suggestions about other stakeholders that I need to involve outside of the students, the parents, the teachers, the administrators, and the school community at large?
Well, Tamecah turned my script on its head here. I said we would be asking her questions, but I love the fact that she also posed a few to us in the audience. So, as I stated earlier, feel free to use the raise hand option here in Zoom. You can come right off of mute if you'd prefer, or you can put your questions, or in this case, responses in our Zoom chat. So I think we're going to start with Monet's question, and then we'll come back to a couple others, or maybe to Monet's answer.
Great job, Tamecah. Beautiful presentation as always.
Thank
I'm
you.
wondering, what do you think the future implications for policy would be in building more parental engagement and involvement?
I think that's very interesting thought process just in terms of policy. Um, because there really is no script for how we do this, right? And I would love to see more policy around parents being involved. One of the probably biggest, arguments or a place of contention in education is who is responsible for all this, who is being held accountable, and teachers feel like we bear the brunt of it. So I think if we do move more towards a policy behind how schools and families partner, I think we would see a better educational landscape in general.
Thank you, Monet. Do you have any follow-ups?
No, I think that was an amazing answer to my question. Thank you so much, Tamecah.
Thank you.
But I'm a stan, so.
There we go. All right, Dr. Rasmussen.
Hi. First of all, that was just a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And so thorough, and I feel like I got everything you were thinking and trying to do. And you took me back to my start in education, which was parental involvement. So my mind was just going in a bunch of different directions, and we're talking decades ago. But it made me wonder your question about the totality of stakeholders, and that's what I wanted to jump into. I'm trying to remember the name of the woman who did research in Berkeley that was so powerful for our work, because I did this within the state of Washington. I live out in Seattle. And she talked about systems of redundancy, especially in high poverty schools, and how that triangle that we always use, the parent teacher student triangle, needed to be expanded to a rectangle, so that you didn't supplant the family, but you supplemented the family for those families that were struggling to engage as fully as needed. So it really based supported the student. So my wonder, or my thinking, as you talk about the totality of stakeholders, is that there may be a role, there may be, and this may come out in your research, but thinking about what are those systems of redundancy that support both the family and the student in ways that allow them to be engaged in that way that we're really looking for. Also in the city of Portland, Oregon, their school system for a number of years started some work in really integrating community and services right into schools. I actually think that they're not doing that anymore. And I don't know why, and that's curious to me, because when I was engaged there, it was very, very effective for students. So in terms of policy and thinking about it in that realm, and I'd be happy to connect to try to find the right people to connect with at any time. So feel free. This was just really exciting research, and thank you for your presentation tonight.
Thank you. I wrote your name, so I'll be in touch.
Thank you, Dr. Rasmussen. Dr. Lynch?
I'm muted. Okay. Thank you. And by the way, I'm very glad that I came this evening, and I'm very glad, Tamecah, that I got to hear and see your presentation. I do think you've conceptualized this incredibly well. I do think it's an important and valuable question, and it's one that's existed as long as I can remember in my whole career. How do we get parents more engaged? Because that tendency from, I used to teach high school, so it was even worse there than middle school, and although there was some fluctuation there. But I just think it's such an important question, and you've really framed it quite well. I don't think I want to respond to your generalizability question, but in general, I just don't think I have enough information here about your numbers, about the numbers of well, we won't know until you do it, how many participants you're actually going to have, although this is going to be one school, correct?
For right now, yes.
Yeah, and how many different class, what's the size of the school?
Around 850 students.
So that's pretty good size.
Mhm.
But you know, if you get a really terrific response, it might be generalizable in some dimensions. But what really concerns me more is that you've sort of baked into this formula both the study of and the solution. And it concerns me a little bit. And again, there's not enough here. We'd have to, read it more and know more about it to really dig in with that. But it's you have a need, you have a commitment to it, you're studying it, and I will predict that you're going to struggle a little bit, because everybody does, with maintaining some sense of objectivity, even if you embrace the subjectiveness of your role in this. If you want to, it's just going to be a challenge for you, I think, since you're trying to find both things out at once. And my guess is you have ideas already about what, after 23 years, if you don't have ideas about what we should be doing, I'd be very surprised. So I would just caution you to be careful about that, keeping those ideas separate. And the best thing you can do, I found at least, is acknowledge those challenges, to be really upfront and out in front about what you bring to the study and what the limitations are for the environment of the study itself. And I wouldn't worry so much about generalizability. It'll either be generalizable or it won't. But that'll be part of what you discover going through the process.
Thank you.
But I don't want to be discouraging. I think it's a great idea.
No, not discouraging at all. Things that I need to take into consideration. So I definitely appreciate that.
So Tamecah, there's also been some really good ideas in the chat. So I encourage you, go back and look through it when you get the opportunity, either for the recording or later this evening, because people really did think about your questions you posed to us, but I think we were thinking them through a little bit more in our writing than in our oral responses. Any other questions for Tamecah about her work, her methodology? With that, we're going to head over to our second presenter. Thank you again, Tamecah.
Thank you.
Our second speaker is Dr. Rebecca Epting, who is a recent EDD graduate from the School of Education. Rebecca is a middle school science teacher, I'm sensing a theme tonight, with over 2 decades of experience in both urban and suburban school districts. Her journey in education began at Pennsylvania State University, where she earned a Bachelor's of Science in Biology. She then continued her educational pursuits with a Master's of Education at Chestnut Hill College. In June of 2023, Rebecca graduated from Drexel University with an education doctorate. Her doctoral research delved into the vital area of racial literacy, specifically exploring how white teachers can effectively learn and practice these crucial skills in today's diverse education environments. This work not only supports her role as a current educator, but also seeks to understand ways in which teachers can foster inclusive and equitable learning environments in schools. In the summer of 2023, Rebecca received the Lindy Center for Civic Engagement Anti-Racism Mini Grant, which allowed her to present her work around developing racial literacy to new teachers in the field. Rebecca's commitment extends beyond the classroom, as evident in her involvement in extracurricular activities. She is the science content leader at her school and is actively involved in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging work in her district. Outside of school, Rebecca enjoys coaching the Taekwondo team over at the University of Pennsylvania. Today, Dr. Rebecca Epting is going to present her research entitled Building Racial Consciousness, a phenomenological study of how white teachers learn and practice racial literacy. Dr. Epting?
Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to present my work over the past few years in racial literacy and understanding racial literacy. I am going to share my screen. Okay. This is the fun part. Okay. There we go. Okay. As said, my work is on building racial consciousness, a phenomenological study of how white teachers learn and practice racial literacy. As a longtime educator, this research is very important to me, and I think also important to the field of education. I know I learned a great deal through this research, so I'm excited to share my research with you this evening. So the concept of racial literacy was actually developed simultaneously by two researchers. Lanny Guinier identified racial literacy as the opposite of racial liberalism, or the opposite of colorblind philosophy. According to Guinier, racial literacy allows us to identify and counter hegemonic practices. Twine's research focused on the racial literacy of individuals. So her work focused on how white parents of biracial children supported their children's development of Black identity. Although the two researchers applied their research to different settings, they both looked at the contextual understanding of racial literacy, where a problem is identified, there's an understanding of cultural knowledge and feedback, and then diagnosing the correct response from that feedback. Most importantly, racial literacy is considered a continuum of learning. So there's not a start point, there's not an end point. Throughout life, a person can actually move back and forth along the continuum, depending on what their experiences are, but hopefully over time moving in the direction of racial literacy. Why is racial literacy important specifically for white teachers? Because as many of us know, there's a significant racial demographic difference between teachers and students in the United States. While 80% of teachers are white and teaching staff are white, only 45% of students are white. And the gap is becoming significantly larger as time goes on. So it's important for white teachers to really understand the students that they're teaching, understand their backgrounds, social, historical context of race, and everything that brings with it. So we're absolutely in need of more teachers of color in schools, right? But it's also necessary for white teachers to develop an understanding of race, how it functions in our education system today, to bridge the divide between those two groups. So when we discuss the skills of racial literacy, there are a few areas of focus in education. So understanding that racism is a present-day problem, understanding that racism affects educational experiences and outcomes, the institutional effects of race in education, an ability to talk about race, an ability to bring an understanding of race to students in the classroom. There's a lot of research that shows that a lack of understanding of race can create a cultural disconnect between teachers and students in the classroom. It can result in lack of representation of diversity in curriculum. It can weaken teacher-student relationships, which are obviously valuable for both the teacher and student to have a beneficial and functional relationship in the classroom. And if teachers aren't consistently reflective of their own practices, it could lead to deficit mindsets due to implicit bias. So the purpose of my study is a qualitative phenomenological study, which explores how white teachers describe their ability to utilize racial literacy skills in their pedagogical practice. Although there is a body of research that focuses on developing the racial literacy skills of pre-service teachers, there is very limited research in describing the experiences of in-service teachers practicing racial literacy or developing racial literacy skills. Each of these bullet points are important pieces of developing racial literacy. So understanding how teachers who are developing their own racial literacy use these skills is important to understanding how to improve professional development experiences for current teachers. So we want teachers to develop their own understanding of race, the role race plays in education today, how to incorporate diverse voices in curriculum, how to address race in classroom communities, and how to develop experiences that help enhance these skills. I'm just going to quickly highlight the literature review. I'll come back to it at the end when I talk about key pieces of information that I learned from my research, but the literature I focused on looked at whiteness in teaching, racial literacy and how it pairs with, or how it parallels with critical race theory, and finally approaches used to develop racial literacy with white teachers. And again, that most of that research is predominantly with pre-service teachers, just a few articles on in-service teachers. My research questions were, how do white teachers integrate racial literacy into their pedagogical practice? My first question addressed the pedagogy of teaching. How did teachers develop a value in understanding race in the classroom? How do they incorporate it into their teaching practices? My second question focused on the development or training teachers have had that helped their racial literacy development. And then the third question focused on how teachers brought that knowledge into their classrooms and created or taught lessons that focus on race. To collect data, I conducted 2 semi-structured interviews with each participant. There was a document discussion and analysis. I felt like this was a place that really strengthened my understanding. In conversations with teachers, they submitted a lesson plan, a lesson activity, or a book study. And they kind of walked me through that document in our second semi-structured interview and talked about how they use it in their classrooms. Initial interview questions were mostly about teacher backgrounds, why they value racial literacy, and any development that they receive in racial literacy. And like I said, the second semi-structured interview was the document discussion and analysis. I also kept a researcher's journal just to collect my thoughts and ideas throughout the research process. These were my participants. I had 5 participants in the study. The table lists the subjects that they teach, obviously their gender, and the number of years that they had in their experience in teaching. As you can see, all the teachers interviewed have been teaching for more than 10 years. They were all from Southeastern Pennsylvania, teaching in public schools. They taught grades 7 through 12. Participants also volunteered for the study knowing that it was on racial literacy. So most of the participants were pretty comfortable discussing race with me in our interviews. The themes that emerged from my data, teaching values and building classroom culture. How do teachers really think through talking about race in their classrooms? And there was a lot, obviously, under that. My second theme was based on professional development, that teachers had either in-service or pre-service. A lot of the professional development was kind of personal experiences that teachers chose to partake in. And then the third theme was really the impact of racial literacy on teaching and student learning. So how do they incorporate it into their curriculum? What skills do students develop from racial literacy? What are student responses and takeaways from conversations about race in the classroom? And then, of course, any challenges. So the first key finding is that teachers who value racial literacy are constantly moving through a cycle of learning, planning, acting, and reflecting as they develop their understanding of race and how to incorporate racial literacy skills into their teaching pedagogy. Teachers described using student feedback in their lessons. They talked about co-planning opportunities in order to prepare and reflect. This pairs nicely with the literature. Mentor and Celie Ruiz, as well as Laughter et al., discuss in-depth ways to reflect when teaching and learning about race. Self-reflection really stood out here. None of these teachers felt like they were experts at talking about race in the classroom. And in many respects, they demonstrated the value they place on these conversations with students because they were very reflective and very intentional in their planning. Like I said, co-planning, practicing lessons beforehand, feedback and reflection were discussed by all of the participants. On this slide, I included a quote from one of the interviews that I thought kind of captured the first key findings. So Edie, who had been teaching for 18 years, or has been teaching for 18 years, she said that she really has to think about when she's framing questions. It's really intensive planning. I guess what I want to say, I'm past the point as a teacher where I need to script out my lessons for myself. But when I'm having lessons like this, I really need to script it out. I need to write my notes in the margin of the text, have them ready to go before we deep dive into the conversation. She says she thinks through every question that she wants to ask, and then every way that students could respond or how the conversation could go to figure out what her response would be in that situation. And again, just like the planning piece was extensive in what teachers talked me through. The second key finding is that professional development in racial literacy is pretty variable and inconsistent across schools. Obviously, it was a small sample size, but I don't think any of the teachers felt like they were fully supported in developing their own racial literacy. Also, it felt like the development needs to support personal growth and personal understanding of race. But also, they didn't feel like their developments did a lot to talk them through or help them understand how to talk about race in the classroom. So again, a lot of the development was on like personal understanding of race and how maybe it affects the positionality in the classroom, but not necessarily how to talk through these conversations with students. In the literature, again, there are explanations of how to critically analyze curriculum, but maybe less research or discussion about how to talk about race in the classroom with students. So this is a place where I think future research would be helpful. My third key finding, implementation of racial literacy in the school curriculum requires teachers to be facilitators of learning, where they're building student skills of critical analysis and interpersonal awareness. Teachers also felt like there is a lack of vetted resources to really make that process easier. Teachers discuss the need to allow students to draw their own conclusions from the work that they do in their class. And they felt like including multiple voices in the curriculum definitely elevates conversations and makes students think more deeply. But finding those resources and making sure that they have the best resources available is very time consuming. One specific place that this was challenging was math. There's a lot in social studies and English, but if a math teacher wants to talk about race in her classroom, that's a much greater challenge to find resources and to bring that into the curriculum. These are two other quotes that I thought just really captured the thought process and what teachers want students to get out of these conversations. there's a lot that carefully planned conversations about race can bring to a classroom, but without planning, those conversations could also cause harm. These two quotes represent what teachers hope that students take away, but it's also a very, it's very important to teachers to tread in the safest way possible because they don't want to cause harm to their students, obviously. And race is one of those things where, you know, especially as a white teacher, you have to be really thoughtful and intentional in your planning. This is kind of a conceptual framework that I came up with after doing all of this research. Just that the real foundation of racial literacy is personal understanding of race, right? Understanding the social historical context of race in America. And understanding how you interact with race, again, as a white teacher. The development in schools is often centered around your personal understanding of race or your positionality, but white teachers need more opportunities to learn how to plan for, practice, and execute lessons that address race in the classroom. Institutional is obviously like a much larger level, and there's a lot of research obviously into that as well. However, my study didn't really go into the institutional aspects of racial literacy, but that would be a possible next step. Implications for practice. So teachers need consistent development and understanding race, understanding the socio-historical context of race, reflecting on personal biases and positionality in the classroom, and developing methods of including multiple voices in their curriculum. Vetted resources, which reflect narratives and counter narratives, are really important to curriculum and are helpful to teachers. Really, teachers need opportunities to work in learning communities and become more comfortable talking about race in the classroom. Working with non-white critical educators and receiving critical feedback is so important. And those opportunities need to happen more frequently. And then finally, professional development around racial literacy needs to be multi-tiered. It needs to address individual growth as well as community growth. Things like book groups, teaching scenarios, and coaching are all things that were in the literature, but did not necessarily translate in my interviews with teachers through this research. I want to give gratitude, of course, to my supervising professor, Dr. Stephanie Smith-Budai, and then my committee members, Dr. Vera Lee and Dr. Jeffrey Lee. Okay, are there any questions? Ooh.
Again, feel free to raise your hand if you've got questions for Rebecca today, or we can put some in the chat as well. So while everybody else is thinking, I'm going to jump in. How did you recruit your participants?
So I had a flyer that kind of articulated what I wanted to get out of the interviews. So people volunteered. I distributed the flyer in any way that I could, through emails, through coworkers, through people that I knew that also knew other educators. But like I said, the study was focused on southeastern Pennsylvania, so it was regional.
I'm curious, did you get mostly teachers that were teaching in in urban settings, suburban settings,
It was a good
rural?
mix, mostly urban and suburban.
Okay. Thank you. All right, your moderator will stop hogging the presenter.
Oh, sorry.
So Sherry Manson's asking, what drew you to this study?
Oh, a lot of things. So, I think that we often as educators, we talk about the need to address race and to talk about race in class, and with students, and address some of the things that are going on in the world. Yet those skills are really challenging, right? And they are skills, right? It sounds like, oh, you should have these conversations, but it's not easy to do. And there's a lot that goes into an understanding of race in America. And I think that if we don't talk about race with our students, then how will they grow and learn and be able to talk about race themselves? So I think that it's something that's not always obvious, but something that was really interesting to me. And I just wanted to know how teachers were managing that, and if they were taking those opportunities, how they were doing that.
Thank you. What we call a problem of practice, right? Dr. Rasmussen.
Well, I didn't want to hog the floor since I asked questions last time, but thank you. It's a really, really fascinating study and totally agree, so needed. I have worked with a colleague at Antioch who's done research on racial discourse, which is a little different than racial literacy. So it was really interesting to see how you approach this. And I don't really have a question. What kind of? So one of my sons got his teaching certificates through Teach for America. Huge focus on racial literacy. And he came back from their boot camp and he said, the content they were teaching was really great, but the way they facilitated it absolutely contradicted everything that they were trying to get us to learn. And it was fascinating, right? He said, and then in his first teaching job, he went to a large urban district and they had also did racial literacy. And he said they had different and very well-trained facilitators. It was a completely different experience. So that was really interesting that the skill level of the facilitators in building this kind of literacy is just huge. And I just, did you uncover some of that in your research?
So it's definitely very different depending on the teacher and especially on the course that they were teaching when they brought it into their classrooms. Like I said, so there is one educator who said that she had one experience that was really supported her development. And the difference was they met either bi-monthly or monthly. So it was a regular check-in, a regular occurrence. It wasn't just like a one-off professional development. And also just like the frequency and the opportunity to learn from different educators and present problems to different educators and really have that very real conversation as opposed to like the higher level, the practice versus the thought of like how the practice should work.
Thank you. Really interesting. Good work. I'm glad you're doing this. Hope you take this out and do something with it.
Which actually, what Dr. Rasmussen's talking about dovetails well with Cindy's question was, can you give an example of what this discussion might look like in the classroom from your participants?
So like I said, they walked me through a lesson plan. So two of the teachers were history teachers. One was an African-American history teacher, a white teacher teaching African-American history. And so they applied it to their curriculum, or they applied their curriculum to those conversations, talking about validity of sources in history classes, like what is the intent this author has? Why are they writing this? What do they want you to do based on this? And what might be their like ulterior motives? And talking about how that plays out along the racial context. And then the English teacher talked about teaching A Raisin in the Sun, talking about redlining, how redlining is specifically like an institutional form of racism, and how it, you know, the results of redlining over time and how it kept people from acquiring wealth, and like, you know, all the different facets of that. And does redlining still happen today? And she was able to apply it to, you know, kind of the area that she was teaching in, like finding examples in local literature about redlining and like what areas were redlined and things like that. So it was a pretty diverse, like depending on the teacher and their content, how they used it. But the intentional planning piece was the most common thread. I would say like teachers were very, very intentional about how they had the conversations with the children, which I think is great and important. Like, I think that was one of the biggest things that came from this. Just all the things that go into the planning, those conversations.
I know we're reaching time. Any last questions here for Rebecca? Rebecca, there's also some comments floating in the chat for you too. So
I started reading the comments in the chat.
like,
Sorry.
you know, when you get the recording, it's easier sometimes to go through.
Okay.
I would love to thank our presenters, Tamecah and Rebecca, for presenting this evening. I want to thank all of you for attending the Colloquium event series. The 23-24 Colloquium series is now held on the first Monday of every month from 7:30 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. And the next event will be Monday, January 8th, 2024. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.